All right, welcome to week 9. We're going to focus on what to kind of do for the inquiry project for this week, and then we'll get into our genre. So, inquiry project, you should have done your proposal and turned that in. I will be giving you feedback and like questions to kind of pay attention to so that as you move forward, you kind of have a little bit more direction with where you might want to kind of explore. For week 9 and week 10, here's kind of where we should be focusing. You'll have 2 deadlines coming up for the inquiry project. The first one is going to be October 28th. You are going to need to post a draft of your project to our workshop discussion board. Because it's a rough draft, at minimum, you need to have at least half of the overall paper length for the track that you picked for the final project. If you're super gung-ho and you're like, I'm just going to write a full rough draft, that's fine, but bare minimum, you need at least half of that paper length. So if you don't remember what the paper lengths are for the track that you picked, please go back and look. Again, that's going to be October 28th that you just need to post your draft. You will have until November 4th to give feedback to your partner. I am just pairing you up with somebody else in class. And I'm giving you about a week to give them feedback so that you can take your time. The workshop discussion board post is going to have more specifics on what I'm expecting you to look for and give feedback on. So don't worry about that just yet, but that's for this week. And like next week, you need to start working on a draft. Please remember that for the inquiry project, you should not be using outside sources. You should only be quoting or paraphrasing from the novel or 2 to 3 novels that you picked for the project. If you're going to be using information that has been covered for like our class's lecture, that is your information. You don't need to cite it. So really the only quotations, paraphrasing, works cited or reference pages that I should see are just linking back to the novels that you picked. So just bear that in mind. So that's kind of what we're working on for the inquiry project. Our topics this week are science fiction and fantasy, which is my like specialization genre. So I will try to keep this short, but there's a lot that's going on with science fiction and fantasy. And most of you have expressed that either like you enjoy science fiction and fantasy or you try to avoid it like the plague. And there's specific reasons why that's your feeling with it. And so we're going to get into it. We're going to start with science fiction first. So we've got this lovely little infographic for science fiction. That's our big genre, one of them. All it means is that it's a story that's based on the idea of what could be a potential future for our world setting because of technology. That's all it is. Because science fiction is our big genre, there's a couple of different subgenres of our big genre, and it's usually sorted into like soft sci-fi and hard sci-fi. Soft sci-fi is when like there is some science fiction technology, medical elements to the story, but it's not like the main heart of it. Um, and it's not something that seems to be like overly explained in the novel. Hard sci-fi, that technology, that medical development, is super grounded in our understanding of science fiction and technology. It is a big component of the novel. Um, so another way to kind of think of this is that soft sci-fi um, tends to have technology that advances um, the human experience or the lived experience. Um, and so it's just kind of like, oh, it's there, but we're focusing more on like the experience with the humanity and the humans. Um, the hard sci-fi, we have like the applied theory part of it. Um, that the technology or the medical advancements are potential, like are a thing that we could create, but because of our political climate, our literal environmental climate, the types of technology that we have access to now, or the cost it would take to create the types of developments, it's not something that's feasible for our real world to get to. So really, it's just soft sci-fi, like the science is there. Hard sci-fi, that science is very much grounded in our reality. It is a huge part of how the world that the book um, is grounded in works. There's another, so this is just like basic definition. Science fiction has a ton of subgenres, and so on the left-hand side, dystopian usually tends to be science fiction based, and I know a lot of you are familiar with like the Hunger Games, Divergent, that's dystopian. You've got our hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi. You've also got like steampunk. You've got alternative histories where like if somebody else won a war or like was able to get to a specific location before other people, like how does that change the trajectory of how our world is developed? You've got science or cyberpunk. Um, you've got space operas, which it's not musical. It can be, but it's usually not. It just means like it's these long journeys in space. Star Trek is a really good example of a space opera. You have got utopians, but you've also got like military like genres. So science fiction is not just like the hardcore science development part. There's a lot of different ways, um, like a different types of subgenres for what science fiction can be. Um, so again, basic definition, it's a setting that kind of guesses, it speculates about a world that if we use what we know about science or what we could be developing with science, or like what we know how to, but we just don't have the means to actually develop, could be a potential real thing in our world. Um, this is just a fun activity. I think this is really interesting. It's kind of a thinking exercise, so you don't have to spend too much time on it. But when talking about the subgenres of science fiction, there's 3 different links to 3 different websites that kind of look at different subgenres. If you just want to kind of pick one, browse through it, see what subgenres are there. Some of them are kind of a little bizarre. Some of them are a little bit strange. Like I think there's um, like Western science fiction. So just kind of, especially if you're not familiar with science fiction, kind of browse, see what kind of subgenres are surprising to you, what you were like, any subgenres that you're like, no, that checks out with what I understand. And kind of just think about like questions that you have about the genre as a whole. Again, this should be very quick, but it's just kind of like a thinking exercise more than anything. This is important. So when we're talking about science fiction elements, usually you've got time travel. These are just options. You've got time travel, you have teleportation, you can have something kind of borders on kind of like superhero-y things, so like mind control, telepathy, telekinesis. Um, Most of what we typically think of when we think of science fiction is those aliens, mutants, space travel. Um, Elements, and that's usually what turns off a lot of readers um, to the genre. Um, so there's a lot of elements. You're going to want to pay attention to the elements for the novel that we're working on reading for this week and next week. I'm not going to read through all of them, but I do want to make sure to emphasize that the aliens, extraterrestrial life forms, and mutants, and the space travel and exploration tends to be like the big defining characteristics of the science fiction genre. Some examples of sci-fi just to kind of help us. A Wrinkle in Time is like one of the most widely known and influential science fiction books that was written for children. Um, it's been made into a movie that I would not recommend, but that is my opinion. But this is like if we're thinking of what is science fiction for younger readers, A Wrinkle in Time is like the big classic example. Um, We've got some of our alien books that are kind of all over the place. Some of these are lower elementary, some of them are middle school. They tend to be like very stereotypical, right? So we've got bottom left, my teacher flunked the planet. My teacher is an alien. Um, aliens ate my homework. So we've got a lot of connections with like alien things and like education. That might be something that would be potentially interesting to look at. Um, in terms of dystopian novels are still kind of one of the most popular um, novels for older children. So, like those middle grade, upper elementary, and young adult readers. All it means is that the society is um, like undesirable. It's not something that everyone can succeed in, or it's downright like terrifying. If we think about Hunger Games, like that is a very terrible world to grow up in as a child. There's usually a lot of suffering or a lot of injustice. It's usually post-apocalyptic from our world, so some sort of like environmental disaster has happened or a fallout from a very uh, like damaging war. And the goal with dystopians is to create a utopia, to create a world where everybody has equal access to things, there's no suffering, there's no shortage of things. That's almost always the goal when you have a dystopian novel. There is a note here to just remind you that dystopians are not always science fiction, they can be fantasy as well. Um, so I've got some examples for elementary readers. There's been quite a few things that have come out recently that are just really well done and really interesting. So Boy and Bot is really good. Ada and the Galaxies is really interesting. I think the one that most of my students that I've taught have enjoyed is the Interstellar Cinderella. It takes a story that students are familiar with and puts it in a science fiction setting, but also May Among the Stars. Has been like really successful. Bottom right hand of your screen, Bijou is a really like interesting picture book that's kind of a little strange. But younger students, like elementary students, tend to really just love the animal character, and kind of the like the illustrations that are going on with it. For middle readers, there's actually way more options for middle grade readers for science fiction than you might think. Sal and Gabby series in the bottom left is very good. There's quite a few of them. The Wild Robot, um, this might be too old a reference for some of you guys, but if you remember the Iron Giant and like Wally, the Wild Robot kind of has similar like vibes going on with it. Dragon Pearl is very good for Asian representation and culture as well, with some of the mythological beliefs with different Asian cultures. Um, the Boy in the Tower is also really interesting. I'm trying to not give like too much details about them, just so that you've got some options. And then for young adult readers, some of the science fiction options that we have you might be familiar with. Maze Runner is a really good one. So is Ready Player One. Um, Brandon Sanderson, you have to be very careful. He kind of dabbles with fantasy and science fiction, but the Skyward um, book is a science fiction one. Not a Drop to Drink is kind of what it sounds like, and is very interesting. Dry is a very similar topic of like what happens when we uh, like run out of our water resources. Um, We Set the Dark on Fire is a newer novel that is uh, really interesting. It deals with like teenagers starting a rebellion, so kind of similar-esque to Hunger Games, but it plays very differently. Um, and Want is really good. If you are a sci-fi fanatic and you enjoy it, Want is a really good one to pick up. So the just examples. When we're thinking about science fiction, something that is helpful is to think about, um, is the science fiction in the novel, um, does it still stand up, right? Is what the novel thinks of as advancing technologies, like did it develop? Do we have them? Um, what has changed with how our technology has developed in our real world? How has that impacted the way that a science fiction novel works? Does it end up making it more into a fantasy thing because we have those technologies? Or does it push it more into fantasy because we have no leads on building those technological advancements? So as you're reading the first part of the Aurora Rising book, I want you to kind of just question and think, what do you know about science fiction today? So what of our technology is different today that's different from when your parents or your grandparents were around your age? So what do we have now that they didn't have? And then also think, what happens, or can science fiction become outdated? Do we need to kind of have a hard line between, after a certain amount of time frame of a book being published, does it need to be pushed into a different genre and not just labeled as science fiction? Again, it's just kind of a thought thing for you, because there's a lot going on with science fiction. Okay. Fantasy is the second genre for this week. And this is going to start very similar to what we did with science fiction. Fantasy, you've got classic fantasy, and sci-fi is also part of fantasy, which is what gets really confusing. When we have classic fantasy, most of you, if you're not a fan of fantasy, you think of high fantasy. You've got elves, you've got dragons, there's swords, maybe there's magic. There's a lot of names for a lot of places and a lot of people and people that people were born from. And it's just, there's a lot to keep track of. There's usually like a map in the front of the book. Maybe the map is also in the back of the book. It's a lot. It's very dense. It doesn't necessarily mean that the book is really thick, but it's just, there's so much information. And there's no technology the way that we tend to think of it. Instead of technology, you're going to have magic. That's kind of our classic fantasy. With sci-fi in the fantasy genre, the magic abilities that are in the novel can be explained with some sort of sciencey technological thing that's not something that we could see as being a potential. So an example is kind of like some of the variations of Spider-Man. We have very venomous spiders that cause different reactions when they bite different animals or people. There's different reactions. That's that sci-fi part. Spider-Man, as a science fiction fantasy character, is him developing those actual spider characteristics. That's not possible in our world, how we understand science. But if we bump it into fantasy, it's totally fine. We don't need to think about it too hard. Magical spider bite equals magical spider powers. Boom. So again, these genres are very, very, very complex. If we're talking about other ways of thinking about subgenres, we've got dark fantasy, which is kind of like what you might think of dark academia. Everything is just literally very dark. The themes are very dark. Usually it's like a very moralistic tale going on. Sometimes it's just depicting all of the gray area decisions that you have to make as a person existing. You've also got your supernatural, paranormal, mystery, romance, fairy tales are fantasy. You've got horror. These are just massive genres. So same thing as what we did with science fiction, just take some time, kind of dig around, don't spend too much time. See what subgenres are popping up that are surprising to you, what is that makes sense, and what questions you might have about the genre because it is so large. Because science fiction and fantasy are my things, I've got two different quotes for us to kind of help maybe rethink about these two genres. So a lot of people think of fantasy and fantasy novels as a way to escape our reality. It's called escapism. Lloyd Alexander is one of the like big scholars for fantasy and like science fiction novel development. Um, Alexander saw fantasy not as a way to escape our reality, but a way to read about our reality, or a way to read about the human existence and like emotions and thought processes and grief, and like happiness and joy, with that distance of it being set in a fantasy setting so that you can read it, not feel super, super close to the emotions that are going on because it's in a fantasy setting, but it helps. He saw it as a way of helping readers understand how people fit and how worlds work. Um, So to kind of make that hopefully make a little bit more sense, right? Fantasy settings, there are these usually huge epic things. There's usually a lot of characters. We are only one tiny speck within the population of our world. So fantasy novels, Alexander saw them as a way for us to kind of read these big epic fantasies and see that like even though we're one individual being, we still have a role, we still have a purpose. There's still like input, impact, and influence that we can have on our worlds because we see them in those novels that we're reading. And then we've got a second one here, that kind of just explains a little bit more that fantasy can kind of show us what could really be possible in a world setting. That we could have a character that is dealing with a lot of grief, like a lot of us go through because we lose people, things change, people get hurt, our bodies change. That grief doesn't have to sit with us. It doesn't have to always be grief. That there is the potential to heal. There is the potential to have hope and realize that yes, there is grief, but there is also more. That's what fantasy is, and that's how we should be thinking of it, not like, oh, it's elves and wizards and like languages that are fake made up. Um, Fantasy allows us to see where we fit within things, but also like where we could fit in things in a very distanced way. I hope that makes sense. Um, when we're talking about types of fantasy, um, this is a little bit more specific than science fiction because there's kind of a longer history with it. Um, so when we're talking about options for kids, we have animal fantasies, we have toys and dolls, which is my least favorite option. We've got like incredible worlds, magical powers, suspense, supernatural, time shift, and high fantasy. Some examples of animal fantasy are like Peter Rabbit, The One and Only Ivan, Tale of Despereaux, Charlotte's Web. Um, there has to be an animal that's the main character. The animal can have human characteristics, but it doesn't have to give them human characteristics. But it does need to include those two things. It has to have animals, and they have to be the main character. For toys and dolls, there's toys or dolls that come to life. Some of these examples are terrible and should not be in classrooms like the Indian in Cover because they perpetuate like harmful stereotypes and racist thinking. Um, but it is one of the unfortunately like main ones that we tend to think of. Um, Toys and dolls coming to life is kind of a weird, very niche type of sub genre for fantasy. Winnie the Pooh is a good option, but it's not necessarily contemporary. Where we typically see dolls and toys being more important and like more common is in the horror genre. So it gets a little um, confusing, and a little bit difficult to pick what is appropriate for kids or not because it jumps into horror usually. Incredible Worlds, Alice in Wonderland, anything that worlds are not like ours that exist. They can be like an extension of ours. So thinking of like characters being shrunk and existing in our world, but in like a smaller version of it that's in spaces that normal people, like normal-sized people, don't have access to. Incredible worlds can also be ones that are literally just like the characters travel to, which is what we see with Alice in Wonderland. Magical powers, Harry Potter is one of the big classic examples. Your characters or your objects have some sort of magical ability or power. The Girl Who Drank the Moon is a more current magical power option that is kind of straddling middle grade and young adult readers, and it is a very, very good option alternative to Harry Potter. Suspense and supernatural. So it's ghost stories or other tales that have some sort of supernatural or like after being alive options. So it's not necessarily like zombies, but it could be like ghouls. It could be some of our more cultural beings, so like Wendigos, skinwalkers, things like that. So Coraline is a very good classic example. The Graveyard Book is a really good option. Small child grows up literally in a graveyard without like human contact and parents. Doll Bones is a really good option. I am terrified of dolls, so I would not pick that up. But it is a really good option that is friendly and like appropriate for younger audiences. It's not like too scary. It's more of like keeping you on the edge of your seat of trying to like figure out what's going to happen. Time Shift. There's not a lot of really good like current options for these. So all they do is they play with either time travel or stopping of time, or time moving in a way that doesn't fit our scientific like way of explaining things. If it can be explained by a scientific phenomenon, then they're no longer fantasy, they get bumped into science fiction. So Tuck Everlasting is a really good example, but it is older. The Magic Treehouse books are a lot of really good examples, but again, they're kind of older. But it's really just playing with how do we perceive, understand time? How does it pass? High fantasy is what most of you think of when you're like, no, I do not like fantasy. It is not my jam. Because we think of The Hobbit, we think of Lord of the Rings, we think of Narnia, we think of adult version Game of Thrones. That's what we tend to think of. It is a fictional world that is not ours. And it usually, not always, has those dragons, elves, dwarves, witches, other like types of races, like tieflings. You could have like gnomes. That's what a lot of people think of and makes them not want to try reading high fantasy or fantasy novels in general. And that's only like a teeny tiny bit of what the genre is itself. This is what's important for this week. When you're talking about fantasy and science fiction, this is the important thing for fantasy. We want to think about common tropes as we are reading Aurora Rising. The first one is the hero's journey, or it's also known as like the chosen one. There's a really good video, it's maybe 3 minutes long, that explains the steps to a hero's journey. But if you have read or watched Star Wars, or Harry Potter, or Lord of the Rings, you know what the hero's journey is. Okay, guaranteed you know what it is. You're going to want to pay attention to see if this is something that is happening in Aurora Rising or not. Another trope in fantasy is the idea of good versus evil. Characters who are like only good have to go against characters who are only evil. Pretty simple. The outsider trope, our main character is unique. They're not like other people. And they have to go up against other forces, other people, and stand up for what it is that they believe in, and how they see like how the world should work for other people. Even if the people that they're kind of fighting against are people that they really would like to be friends with or have as part of their family. First Love, our main characters end up growing. They deal with conflicts. Usually it's communication issues, and they end up falling in love. And main characters end up realizing that, like, oh, all of these communication issues and like these bumps along the way don't really mean anything because I love this other person. They're tropes for a reason if they sound kind of cheesy. That's usually connected to a trope. Um, some other tropes, adults as adversaries, our main characters are like children or teenagers, and the adults are the ones that are causing the problems. But when the solution is found, our main characters go, oh no, the adult might have been correct. And so like the adults are the problem, but also they might be trying to help fix the problem. Um, Dystopian societies we should be really familiar with because we see these stories all the time. There's some sort of weakness or issue with the society, and it needs to be fixed in order for people to live better. Love triangles, there are 3 people or more who are involved in romantic interests with each other. Usually, the love triangle is the main conflict. However, the main character, because they're involved in a love triangle, romantic situationship thing, we get to reflect on the main character's characteristics to try to figure out, like, what did they quote unquote do wrong in order to have been stuck in a love triangle. We have reluctant royalty. Our main character has to grow up. They have to no longer be a child. They have to be forced into young adulthood or adulthood because of what other people expect them, because of who they are, because of their birth, because of who their family is. They do not get to continue being a child. They have to take on the task of being an adult to try and help their society, their people continue. Whew. Hero's journey, real quick. These are really good classic examples. Any sort of superhero, they've gone through the hero's journey. Um, any sort of superhero, not joking. Disney has a lot of hero's journeys, usually with main characters who are male. Um, they're there to save the world, and they're the only ones that can do it. Um, they're going to talk about some issues with fantasy, and it's specifically fantasy more than science fiction, unfortunately. Um, this is related to a lot of what we've talked about already, especially when we were focusing on diversity. A lot of fantasy um, was written by white males for white readers with white characters, usually white male characters. So even though a fantasy has these fantastical creatures potentially, like dragons and griffins and unicorns, the people historically who are allowed to be in these spaces as these characters have been predominantly white males. So even in worlds that are not supposed to be based on our own, people of color, women, non-binary people are I have not been welcomed, have not been included. For example, as much as I love Lord of the Rings, it is very much whitewashed. Game of Thrones, Star Wars, it's mostly white characters and predominantly male. Got some more examples. Chronicles of Narnia is kind of a different thing, but it is still more predominantly male. The women in Narnia are the ones that ended up kind of being disconnected from the fantastical world because they have to grow up and mature. The reason why we have that is because of some of these lovely people. The creator of Peter Pan, these are all old dead white dudes. Okay. We got Lewis Carroll who created Alice in Wonderland, and The Jabberwocky as a fictional like monster, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, um, Frank Bottom, the creator of The Wizard of Oz. These are our like foundational texts, our canonical text for fantasy. They've had a huge influence on the entire genre. All of that historical context, not the fantasy genre is getting significantly better, like what we discussed about with Diversity Week. Zetta Elliott is one of the main contributors to kind of changing, diversifying the genre. She's created a lot of different series for like upper elementary, middle grade that picture female characters, that picture people of color in fantastical settings, and she is a huge advocate of allowing magical worlds, fantasy worlds to be an option for all children, not just specific children, so that everybody is able to exist and belong in these worlds. Her books are a really great option. Like, really, really good option. Like I said, representation for novels have gotten better. We're gonna just have some of them as examples. Hate U Give is it borders with fantasy, but it is very, very close to like our world. So it is kind of like magical realism a little bit. Akata Witch, so good. If you loved Harry Potter and you want like magical settings that are based in a magic system that is not based off of like European ideas of magic and myths, Akata Witch is so good. Um, Rogue Princess blends fantasy and science fiction really well. Anything written by Marie Lu is really, really well done. Um, Dasgupta in the bottom left has more like middle grade stuff, and her fantasy options are usually more like Indonesian and like Indian representations, which is a very, very small marginalized group, especially in fantasy. Um, these are like meh options. Red Rising, Pendragon, anything really by Neal Shusterman or Patrick Ness. Um, they have male protagonists, but they're not always white. They're not always cisgender. Um, so like we've got some okay options. Um, you should be reading Aurora Rising Part 1. The big thing I just want to tell you is to make sure that you pay attention to figuring out what character you like the most so far. It is going to be a lot. There are 7 characters. Just try to focus on the characters and the relationships and don't get stuck on what is going on story-wise. You will figure that out as you continue reading. So focus on our character relationships, focus on their friendships or not friendships. Try to focus on that. I have this here to kind of help because it is a lot of characters. All of these characters are our main characters. So we have Tyler, who you meet first, and then you meet Ari, who's on the very right-hand side. You have Scarlet, Kat, Zyla, Finn, and Cal. They each have their own chapters to kind of help you figure them out. But again, focus on the characters, focus on their interactions, especially to help you with your response. You're going to need to identify like who's your favorite character so far, who's your least favorite character so far, and why, and not worrying so much about the science fiction fantasy elements. You will get those the second week of reading this book.